The evening air in the city carried the familiar scent of freshly baked bread and sizzling steaks from upscale restaurants, mingling with the acrid fumes of traffic. The streets bustled with well-dressed patrons heading to fine dining establishments, their polished shoes tapping against the pavement. Among them, unnoticed, was a young girl, barefoot, clad in rags, her small figure blending into the shadows of the alleyways. Lyra, no older than 14, had known hunger for as long as she could remember. Her stomach had long since stopped growling, accustomed to days without food. She had learned where to look, the back alleys of high-end restaurants, where waste bins often held treasures discarded by those who had too much. It wasn't glamorous, but survival never was. That night, she made her way to the rear of the Sterling, one of the most prestigious restaurants in the city, known for its exquisite cuisine and wealthy clientele. She moved with the silence of someone who had learned to avoid notice, her feet light on the cold, cracked pavement. The restaurant's dumpsters often held half-eaten bread rolls, untouched side dishes, or even whole entrees thrown away by customers who had barely touched their food. She just needed to be quick. As she approached the dumpsters, the intoxicating aroma of garlic butter and seared steak made her mouth water. But before she could begin her nightly routine, a faint sound caught her attention, high heels clicking against the marble floor inside the kitchen. Curious, she tiptoed toward the fogged-over window, her breath coming out in wisps against the cool glass. Inside, chefs in crisp white coats bustled about, plating meals with precision, their voices blending into the rhythmic clatter of knives against cutting boards. The waitstaff moved swiftly, their polished shoes gliding over the tiled floor as they prepared for the dinner rush. Then, Lyra's eyes landed on a woman who stood out from the rest. Grace Vanderbilt. Even Lyra, a girl who lived on the streets, recognized her face. It had graced the covers of glossy magazines, accompanied by headlines praising her beauty, wealth, and lavish lifestyle. Dressed in a fitted crimson dress and black lace gloves, Grace moved through the kitchen with an air of authority. She had no business being there, people of her status rarely mingled with restaurant staff. Lyra watched, fascinated yet wary, as Grace approached the counter where a waiter was preparing a dish. The plate was an artful masterpiece, a filet mignon, medium rare, with a side of buttery asparagus and roasted potatoes. Something wasn't right. Lyra's gaze sharpened as Grace reached into her designer handbag and discreetly pulled out a tiny vial. The glass container, no larger than a tube of lipstick, held a dark, viscous liquid. The overhead lights reflected off the bottle as she carefully tilted it, allowing a few drops to land on the steak. The movement was so subtle, so practiced, that the waiter, momentarily distracted, didn't notice a thing. Lyra's breath hitched. Her pulse pounded in her ears as realization struck. Poison. Her fingers dug into the frame of the window, her mind racing. Who is this meant for? Why would she do this? Grace tucked the vial back into her purse as though she had simply reapplied perfume. With the same serene smile she had worn all evening, she stepped back and nodded approvingly at the plate before leaving the kitchen, her red dress flowing behind her like a trail of fire. Lyra's stomach twisted with unease. The dish, poisoned, tainted, deadly, was about to be served. Someone was going to die tonight. And she was the only one who knew. The Sterling buzzed with the quiet hum of conversation, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the occasional burst of laughter. Beneath the golden chandeliers, men in tailored suits and women in shimmering gowns dined on perfectly plated meals, oblivious to the unfolding tragedy. Lyra's heart pounded against her ribs as she sprinted toward the dining room. The weight of what she had just witnessed pressed heavily on her chest. I have to stop him. I have to make him hear me. Bursting through the doorway, her voice rang out across the restaurant. Don't eat that. Your wife put poison in your food. Silas Vanderbilt, seated at the center of the room like a king at a feast, had already raised his fork. A piece of filet mignon, glistening under the warm candlelight, was just inches from his mouth. At the sound of Lyra's cry, he hesitated, his brow furrowing as he turned toward the source of the commotion. Gasps rippled through the restaurant. Waiters froze mid-step. Guests craned their necks to see the ragged girl standing in the grand hall, barefoot, her clothes stained with city grime. A burly security guard lunged for her. "Get her out of here," someone barked. Lyra struggled against the man's iron grip, her voice raw with desperation. "You have to believe me. It's a mistake. Don't eat it." But it was too late. Silas had already taken the bite. A shadow of confusion crossed his face. He blinked, then frowned, his hand rising to his throat. The fork slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering against the porcelain plate. A single moment of silence. Then, chaos. Silas lurched forward, knocking over his wine glass. The deep red liquid bled across the tablecloth as he coughed violently, his body convulsing. His face twisted in pain, beads of sweat forming on his brow. "He's choking," someone screamed. Lyra wrenched herself free and bolted toward him. The security guard grabbed for her again, but she ducked under his arm, sliding to her knees beside Silas just as his body crumpled onto the floor. "Somebody call 911, a woman shrieked. Silas's breaths came in short, ragged gasps. His complexion had turned an alarming shade of gray, and his hands clawed weakly at his chest. Lyra had seen this before, the convulsions, the way the body fought against the poison. She had spent years on the streets, where sickness was a silent killer, and she had watched people die from things that could have been prevented if someone had just acted in time. She wouldn't let that happen now. "Roll him onto his side," she shouted, her small hands pressing against his shoulder. A waiter hesitated, looking at her in shock. "Do it," Lyra barked, the urgency in her voice cutting through the panic. Together, they turned Silas onto his side just as his body spasmed violently. His fingers twitched, his lips parted in a desperate attempt for air. "He needs help now." Lyra looked up, scanning the crowd. "Where's the ambulance?" Footsteps pounded against the marble floor as restaurant staff scrambled in every direction. The maitre d' shouted for paramedics, but Lyra knew they had minutes, maybe less, before the poison took full effect. With trembling hands, she unfastened Silas's tie, loosening the fabric constricting his throat. His pulse was weak beneath her fingertips. "Stay with me," she whispered, barely aware of the tears stinging her eyes. Sirens wailed in the distance. The flashing red and blue lights reflected against the restaurant's massive glass windows. Lyra exhaled in relief, help was coming. But then, through the chaos, she saw her. Grace Vanderbilt stood near the entrance, her expression perfectly composed. Unlike the other guests, who were panicking, Grace remained eerily calm, her red lips pursed as she observed the scene before her. Their eyes met. Lyra saw it then, the cold, calculated hatred in Grace's gaze. No fear. No worry. Just annoyance. As if Silas's suffering was nothing more than an inconvenience. Lyra's blood ran cold. She had done this. And now, as the sirens screamed louder, Grace turned on her heel and slipped quietly out the door. The flashing red and blue lights of the ambulance and police cars cast eerie shadows across the Sterling's polished marble floors. The once elegant restaurant had transformed into a scene of chaos, waiters rushing, guests whispering, the maitre d' barking orders, and paramedics kneeling beside Silas Vanderbilt, their voices tense as they worked to stabilize him. Lyra remained frozen, her knees pressing against the cold tile. Silas's pulse was weak under her trembling fingers, but at least he was still alive. She had done everything she could. Then, rough hands grabbed her by the arms. She yelped, instinctively trying to pull away, but the grip tightened. The security guard, the same one who had thrown her out minutes earlier, was now restraining her as if she were a criminal. "What are you doing?" "I was trying to help," she protested, struggling against his hold. "Help," the maitre d' scoffed. "You came in here screaming like a lunatic, and now Mr. Vanderbilt is lying on the floor fighting for his life? You think we're stupid?" The murmurs in the room grew louder. Guests whispered behind delicate hands. Some took out their phones, recording her as if she were a spectacle rather than a terrified girl trying to save a life. "That's the girl who caused the scene. She probably put something in his food. Homeless kids, always looking for trouble." Lyra's heart pounded. "They think I did this." "No. You don't understand," she pleaded. "It wasn't me. His wife, she put poison in his food. I saw her do it." The crowd gasped. Someone let out a shocked whisper, but it wasn't directed at Grace. Instead, it was aimed at Lyra. "How dare you?" came a soft, trembling voice. Lyra turned her head just in time to see Grace Vanderbilt stepping into the center of the room. She had returned, her red dress still flawless, her expression the perfect mask of grief. She dabbed her eyes with a silk handkerchief, though not a single tear had fallen. "This child is accusing me?" Grace's voice broke slightly, just enough to sound convincingly hurt. "My husband is fighting for his life, and she's standing here blaming me?" Lyra's breath caught in her throat. She knew the truth, but Grace was convincing. Every word was spoken with just the right amount of devastation, the kind of performance that could sway anyone who didn't know better. "She's lying," Lyra burst out. "I saw her in the kitchen. She took a vial out of her purse and put something in his food. I swear." The room fell silent. Then, someone laughed, a dry, bitter chuckle. The head of security stepped forward, shaking his head. "And we're supposed to believe a filthy little street thief over Mrs. Vanderbilt?" The words stung worse than the grip on her arms. Lyra's chest heaved. "I'm not lying. Check the security cameras. Look in her purse. You'll see I'm telling the truth." Grace inhaled sharply, shaking her head as if she were too overwhelmed to respond. A few guests murmured sympathetically. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was on a phone call. I left the restaurant while my husband finished his meal. This girl, she hesitated just long enough to appear truly wounded. She must have snuck in and done something to his plate while no one was looking." Lyra's stomach twisted. The phone call. Of course. Grace had left just before Silas took his first bite. She had planned it that way, making sure she had an alibi. "She's trying to frame me," Lyra shouted. "She wanted him dead, and now she's making you believe it was me." A heavy police officer stepped forward, his boots clanking against the tile. He studied Lyra for a moment, then turned to the maitre d'. "Did anyone see this girl enter the kitchen?" "She was lurking around all day," the maitre d' replied without hesitation. "She was probably waiting for the perfect moment." Lyra's stomach dropped. "I wasn't." "Enough," the officer said, pulling out his handcuffs. "You're coming with us." "No." "Please, just listen," she begged as he turned her around, snapping the cold steel around her wrists. The cuffs were too tight. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. This wasn't happening. "Wait," a young waiter suddenly called out. For a brief second, hope flared. The officer turned. "What is it?" The waiter hesitated. He had seen Grace near the plate before Silas took a bite. He had noticed how quickly she left. But then Grace met his eyes, tilting her head ever so slightly. A silent warning. The waiter's face paled. He looked down. "Nothing. I must have been mistaken." The last bit of fight left Lyra's body. Her vision blurred as she was dragged out of the restaurant, past people who would never believe her. As the police car door slammed shut, she saw Grace through the window, standing there, her hand over her heart. Her face was full of sorrow. But her eyes? Her eyes were full of victory. A steady beep, beep, beep filled the hospital room, the rhythmic sound of the heart monitor blending with the soft hum of medical equipment. The air smelled of antiseptic and fresh linens, the scent sharp and sterile. Silas Vanderbilt lay motionless in the hospital bed, his body weakened but alive. The poison had nearly taken him. It had burned through his veins, twisting his body into violent convulsions, sending him to the very edge of death's door. But somehow, he had survived. The doctors had worked tirelessly through the night, administering emergency treatments, flushing his system of the toxin. Now, his breathing was steady. His skin had regained some color. His body was weak, but his mind was beginning to stir. His eyelids fluttered, the bright hospital lights stabbing through the fog of unconsciousness. His throat felt raw, his muscles aching as if he had been through a war. Slowly, painfully, he tried to move his fingers. They twitched, stiff but responsive. He was alive. A deep voice broke the silence. "Mr. Vanderbilt?" Silas turned his head slightly, groaning at the effort. A doctor stood beside his bed, clipboard in hand, his expression calm yet watchful. "You're in Mercy General Hospital. You were brought in after experiencing a severe reaction to an unknown toxin. Do you remember what happened?" Silas swallowed, his throat dry. He struggled to form words. The doctor poured a glass of water from a nearby pitcher and brought it to Silas's lips. The cool liquid soothed his burning throat. "I was at the restaurant," Silas rasped, his voice hoarse. "The Sterling." The doctor nodded. "Yes. You collapsed there. The paramedics said a young girl was with you when they arrived. She insisted you had been poisoned." Silas blinked. "A girl?" Images flickered in his mind, scattered and fragmented. The elegant restaurant. The soft glow of candlelight. The rich, savory taste of steak, then pain. Excruciating, unbearable pain. The room spinning. And then, a voice. A desperate, urgent voice shouting through the chaos. "Don't eat that. Your wife put poison in your food." Silas's heart pounded as a name surfaced from the depths of his foggy memory. Lyra. The girl. She had been there. He forced himself to sit up, wincing as his muscles protested. Where is she?" The doctor exchanged a glance with the nurse beside him. "Mr. Vanderbilt, you need to rest." "No," Silas insisted, gripping the sheets weakly. "The girl. The one who saved me. Where is she?" The nurse hesitated. "We don't have any record of her. The only visitor listed under your name is your wife." Silas stiffened. Grace. The memories rushed in like a tidal wave. Grace had been at the restaurant. She had left early, claiming to take a phone call. And then, Lyra's scream. The unbearable pain. The way Grace had appeared so perfectly composed while he writhed on the floor, fighting for his life. Silas's breath hitched. She had done this. She had tried to kill him. The heart monitor's beeping quickened, matching the pounding in his chest. "Mr. Vanderbilt," the doctor warned, "your body is still recovering. You need to stay calm." But how could he stay calm when the woman he had trusted, the woman he had shared his life with, had plotted his death? And Lyra, where was she? "She saved me," he muttered, his mind racing. "She knew. She tried to warn me. And now she's gone?" The doctor's expression darkened. "The police took her." Silas's stomach dropped. "What?" "She was accused of poisoning you." "No," Silas said firmly, shaking his head. "That's wrong. She tried to stop it. She tried to save me. She insisted your wife was responsible," the nurse added hesitantly. "But Mrs. Vanderbilt, well, she claimed the girl was the one who did it." Silas's hands clenched into fists. Of course Grace had twisted the story. Of course she had found a way to turn the blame onto someone else. His chest ached, not just from the poison's lingering effects, but from the sheer betrayal. All these years, he had thought Grace loved him. That they had built something real. And yet, she had seen him as nothing more than an obstacle. An inconvenience standing in the way of her wealth and power. His jaw tightened. Lyra had risked everything to save him. And now she was paying the price for it. He couldn't let that happen. "Where is she now?" Silas asked. The doctor hesitated. "She was arrested." Silas exhaled sharply. "She's in jail." The grand entrance of the Vanderbilt mansion loomed ahead, its towering white columns bathed in the dim glow of the evening lights. Silas Vanderbilt stepped out of the car, his body still weak from his near-death experience, but his mind sharper than ever. He had spent years in this house, believing it to be a home. Now, it felt like a gilded cage, a place where betrayal had festered right under his nose. The night air was crisp, the scent of manicured roses hanging in the breeze. He gripped the wrought iron railing as he climbed the steps, steadying himself. His body was still recovering, but there was no time to wait. He had barely convinced the hospital to discharge him early, and every second he delayed was a second Grace could use to cover her tracks. He wouldn't let that happen. The butler, an older man who had worked for the Vanderbilts for decades, opened the door, his eyes widening in shock. "Mr. Vanderbilt. We weren't expecting you. Where is she?" Silas cut in, his voice firm. The butler hesitated, glancing toward the grand staircase. "She's in your study, sir." "Shall I?" "No," Silas said, pushing past him. "I'll handle this myself." His polished shoes echoed against the marble floors as he strode through the house. Each step fueled his anger. The years of trust, the carefully crafted lies, the perfect facade, Grace had played her part flawlessly. And if it weren't for Lyra, she might have succeeded. Reaching the study, he pushed open the heavy oak doors with more force than necessary. Grace Vanderbilt stood by the fireplace, a glass of red wine in her manicured hand. Dressed in an elegant silk robe, she looked every bit the grieving wife, if one didn't notice the calculated calm in her expression. She turned slowly, feigning surprise. "Silas," she gasped, placing a delicate hand over her heart. "You're home? I wasn't expecting you back so soon. You should be resting, darling." Silas clenched his jaw, stepping inside and shutting the door behind him. "Drop the act, Grace." A flicker of something crossed her face, annoyance, perhaps, or recognition that her performance was no longer working. But it disappeared just as quickly, replaced by a carefully measured look of concern. "I don't understand," she said softly, taking a step closer. "What's wrong?" Silas scoffed. "You tried to kill me, Grace. Don't pretend you don't know exactly what I'm talking about." She stiffened, the glass in her hand trembling slightly before she steadied herself. "That's a terrible thing to say, Silas." "I heard you," he pressed, his voice low, dangerous. "In the restaurant. You left early. You knew exactly what would happen. And at the hospital, while I was barely hanging on, you made sure to twist the story, didn't you? You blamed that girl, the only person who actually saved me." Grace exhaled slowly, setting her wine glass down with deliberate ease. "You're confused," she said smoothly. "The doctors said the poison could have affected your memory. You've been through a lot, darling." Silas stepped closer, his eyes locked onto hers. "I remember everything. I remember Lyra screaming for me to stop. I remember the look on your face as I collapsed. You weren't afraid, Grace. You weren't shocked. You were waiting for it to happen." Her lips pressed together, a small muscle in her jaw twitching. She knew the game was up. But Grace Vanderbilt had never been one to lose gracefully. She let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head as she picked up the wine glass again. "You always were so sentimental, Silas," she murmured. "So desperate to believe in love, in loyalty." She took a slow sip before continuing. "But let's be honest, this was bound to happen sooner or later. You never really saw me, did you? You saw what you wanted to see." Silas's blood boiled. "You were my wife." Grace smirked. "And you were my ticket to a life I deserved." The words hit him harder than any blow could have. For years, he had thought their marriage was built on partnership, mutual respect, maybe even love. But Grace had never cared for any of that. To her, he had been nothing more than a stepping stone, an obstacle to be removed when the time was right. Silas inhaled deeply, steadying himself. "It's over, Grace. I called the police before I walked in here. They're on their way." For the first time, true panic flashed across her face. "You what?" Silas folded his arms. "You heard me. I gave them everything. Your confession. They're going to hear it from me directly. And Lyra, when she's released, she'll tell them exactly what she saw." Grace's eyes darted toward the door. She took a step back, calculating her next move. Then, without warning, she lunged for the small drawer in the desk. Silas was faster. He reached it first, slamming it shut before she could grab what was inside, a gun. Grace stumbled back, breathing heavily, her composure cracking. "You can't prove anything," she spat. "It's your word against mine." Silas leaned in, his voice dangerously calm. "I have more than just my word. I have security footage from the restaurant. I have the poison traces they found in your purse. And soon, I'll have the truth, from Lyra, from the staff, from every single person who saw you walk out of that restaurant without a second glance back." A car pulled up outside. The distant sound of sirens grew louder. Grace's face twisted in fury. "You think you've won?" she hissed. Silas straightened. "No. I know I have." The front doors burst open. The pounding of heavy boots filled the house as officers flooded in. "Grace Vanderbilt," a deep voice called from the hallway, "you are under arrest for the attempted murder of Silas Vanderbilt." Grace turned toward the door, her shoulders stiff. Slowly, she looked back at Silas, her lips curling into a bitter smile. "Well, "Darling," she whispered, "I guess you were worth more alive than dead after all." As the officers pulled her away, Silas exhaled, his body finally relaxing. The weight of betrayal, of nearly dying at the hands of the woman he once loved, still pressed against him. But for the first time in a long time, justice had won. And somewhere out there, a girl named Lyra was about to be free. The sound of sirens filled the air, their wailing echoing against the grand walls of the Vanderbilt estate. Police officers rushed through the marble-floored hallways, their radios crackling with urgency. The house, once a symbol of power, luxury, and wealth, had now become the center of a crime scene. Silas Vanderbilt stood in the dim light of his study, his pulse still racing. His body, still weak from the poisoning, ached with exhaustion, but his mind was sharp, clearer than it had been in years. Grace was finally exposed. After everything, after years of deception, after nearly losing his life at her hands, he had confronted her. He had called the police. And for a fleeting moment, he thought it was over. But then, just as the officers moved in to arrest her, she ran. By the time they reached the front entrance, Grace had vanished into the night. Silas clenched his jaw, his fingers curling into fists. He should have known she wouldn't go quietly. Grace Vanderbilt had spent her entire life manipulating people, twisting situations to her advantage. She had nearly killed him, framed an innocent girl, and walked away without a second thought. She wasn't going to stop now. A police lieutenant approached, his face tight with frustration. "Mr. Vanderbilt, we have units searching the perimeter, but there's no sign of her yet." She had an escape plan. Silas exhaled sharply. "Of course she did." "She won't go far," he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "Not yet." The lieutenant frowned. "You think she's still in the city?" "She's too smart to disappear completely," Silas muttered. "She won't run without her money, her connections. Grace doesn't know how to live without power." The officer nodded. "We'll put out an APB. If she tries to withdraw cash, use a credit card, or contact anyone, she's ours." Silas ran a hand through his hair, his mind already moving ahead. He had spent years playing the role of a devoted husband, blind to the truth. Now, he saw Grace for what she really was. And he wouldn't stop until she was behind bars. But there was something even more urgent than finding her. Lyra. The girl who had risked everything to save his life. The girl who had been arrested because of Grace's lies. Silas turned to the officer. "What about the girl?" "Lyra?" The lieutenant hesitated. "She's still in custody." Silas's eyes darkened. "You mean to tell me," he said, his voice dangerously low, "that she's been sitting in a jail cell while the real criminal ran free?" The officer shifted uncomfortably. "We had no proof at the time." Mrs. Vanderbilt, well, she was convincing. And Lyra, she's just a kid. A homeless one at that. The system isn't kind to kids like her. Silas felt a sharp pang of guilt. How many times had he walked past children like Lyra on the street, never giving them a second thought? And yet, she had saved him. Now, she was paying the price for his ignorance. "That ends tonight," Silas said firmly. "I want her released. Now." The lieutenant hesitated. "Mr. Vanderbilt, we can't just—" "I'm the victim here," Silas snapped. "And I'm telling you, she saved my life. That's all the proof you need." The officer sighed, then radioed in. After a tense silence, he turned back. "We'll have her processed out within the hour." Silas exhaled, a weight lifting from his chest. But this wasn't over. Not yet. Grace was still out there. And he wouldn't rest until she was caught. Because this time, justice wouldn't slip away. Life has a way of revealing the truth, no matter how deeply it is buried. Silas Vanderbilt's story reminds us that betrayal often comes from those we trust the most. Yet, even in the face of deception, justice prevails when we dare to seek it. One of the most powerful lessons from this tale is that courage isn't measured by wealth or status, but by the strength of one's character. Lyra, a homeless girl with nothing to her name, had more integrity and bravery than those who lived in luxury. She risked everything to save a stranger, proving that true goodness exists even in the most unexpected places. For those of us who have lived long enough to see both the best and worst in people, this story serves as a reminder that the truth will always surface, no matter how much others try to suppress it. We are never too old to stand for what is right, to protect those who cannot protect themselves, or to seek justice when it is denied. It also teaches us not to judge by appearances. Society often overlooks the value of those who seem powerless, yet they are often the ones who hold the greatest wisdom and kindness. In our own lives, we may not face betrayal as dramatic as Silas's, but we all encounter moments when we must choose between silence and speaking up. When those moments come, may we find the courage to be like Lyra, to act, to fight for justice, and to believe that even one voice can make a difference.